stable and can give the impression that it's sort of swimming beneath the road surface. The track itself, cars, surroundings, and all that all rely on polygons, and again, given its release time frame, it also doesn't likely leverage the multi-CPU architecture of Saturn, which is something a lot of Western devs struggled with at the time, so given all that, it's not really surprising that it runs a lot worse. Despite that, Destruction Derby 2 was being planned for Saturn, with Probe Entertainment even starting work on it, but by this point, Perfect 10, the publisher, had given up on Saturn entirely and the conversion was scrapped. Beyond these racing games, there were other Psygnosis titles ported to Sega Saturn, but those will have to wait for the proper episode.
Round one!
For now, let's instead
Ready?
turn our gaze
Go!
towards another large publisher, Electronic Arts. EA was a big supporter of the PlayStation. Early on, they also supported Sega Saturn. After all, they had a lot of success with Genesis, and it was clear who was going to come out on top. During its lifespan, EA would release 5 different racing games that appeared on both platforms.
Knockout!
Road and Trek presents the Need for Speed is one of the best.
Round
The
two!
Need for Speed series itself
Ready?
became a juggernaut at the time, but didn't start here with the original game. First launched on the 3DO platform, the Need for Speed aims for a more realistic style of racing. The sense of speed is there, but it's a game with no music, focused entirely on making your way down the road while doing battle head-to-head with the X-Men.
Round three!
In addition
Ready?
to a PC
Go!
release, Need for Speed also came to the PlayStation and Saturn.
Deck your halls with more of the latest Unwrap classic festive favorites. Upgrade today for just £10 a month.
Knockout!
この強さが欲しかったのだ。
Round one! Ready? Go! Knockout! Round two! Ready? Go! Knockout! Round three! Ready? Go! Knockout! Knockout!
いかがかな
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout!
この強さが欲しかったのだ。
The PlayStation version arrived roughly 6 months after the launch of the console in North America, while the Saturn version appeared in the summer of 1996. All the content from the 3DO game is there, but it was expanded with new tracks. The Saturn and PlayStation versions also feature an entirely different menu system. I've always been fascinated by this game though, as all 3 consoles exhibit major technical differences. You'll recognize the various tracks between them, but each one has its own quirks and visual appearance. Now, in bringing the game to the new consoles, the sense of speed was ramped up, music was added to gameplay, and the entire vibe of the game has changed. Now, at first glance it looks similar enough, but you'll notice that there are some pretty obvious differences here. The sky rendering, for instance. The colors are completely different between Saturn and PlayStation, and on Saturn, they use VDP2 to render this background layer, much like we saw in Wipeout and Destruction Derby. The 3DO also has this sort of weird in-between sky that actually kind of looks the best and creates the sensation of being better integrated into the 3D scene. Unlike Wipeout, it seems like they've taken a different approach to textures and color data between the two games, as they wind up looking very different. The grays, greens, and whatever are all represented in a different way on each machine. Furthermore, shadows on PlayStation 1 are transparent, but likely in an effort to avoid dithering, the Saturn just uses fully black shadows instead, which honestly, it's a good choice. The camera height and position was also changed for the third-person camera, and things like dark tunnels exhibit different lighting characteristics between the two. I would say the Saturn version looks a little cleaner overall, as it lacks the dithering of the PlayStation game. It's when we get to performance though that we really see the Saturn version pull ahead. You see, on PlayStation the game runs without vertical sync, so there's constant screen tearing appearing across every frame. Both versions run with an unstable frame rate, but I feel that Saturn is more consistent and stable overall with vertical sync, while even managing a stable 30 frames per second for long stretches, something that just never really happens on the PlayStation. The game just feels a lot better to play. It's smoother than PlayStation and the 3DO original. I'm sure it even bests the PC version on PCs of that era, making this arguably the best way to play Need for Speed circa 1996. Following a similar trajectory then, Road Rash also made the jump to Saturn and PlayStation. This one also started life on 3DO and then received ports to these machines and the PC. I covered all of this in great depth last year in our Road Rash episode, but to reiterate, the differences here are similar to the Need for Speed. Basically, PS1 and 3DO have slightly finer shading on certain details versus Saturn, such as these dark spaces between the buildings, but Saturn absolutely smokes them when it comes to performance. It's far and away the best running version of Road Rash, and it also lacks the noisy dithering of the PS1 version. It's definitely my favorite version to play. The only caveat really is that the soundtrack on Saturn is a lot worse than the other versions. Take a listen.
Hey Meta, take video.
What are you doing by yourself? Come on. That's cool. What are you doing? What are you doing? Please don't post that.
As I said in the Road Rash episode, I think the 3DO version sounds the best by far, and the Saturn version is pretty bad. But in terms of gameplay and fluidity, I actually think the game fares best on the Saturn. If you want to learn more about Road Rash though, I recommend going off and watching that video next. There's a lot there. Then we have High Octane from Bullfrog and EA. This is actually the first EA racing game released for these new consoles, but I wanted to save it until we talked about Road Rash and
I'll
Need
give
for
it
Speed
100%.
because, well, it's
Round
just not
one.
very good.
Ready,
You see, this project
go!
was a stall for time, a Dungeon Keeper. A small team within Bullfrog basically tossed together this futuristic racing game using technology that was created from Magic Carpet, and on consoles at least, the result is an absolute mess. I almost want to apologize to Wipeout on Saturn for criticizing its 20 frames per second frame rate, because after playing High Octane, oh boy. You see, despite the name, this is a game that both looks poor and runs so much worse on both machines. Now technically,
Round two.
PlayStation does have a slight edge
Ready,
here.
go!
We have a more advanced sky system, actual textures in the vehicles and whatnot, but make no mistake, this game runs terribly on both consoles, dropping as low as 9 frames per second. It's simply not good enough. As with other games, I wanted to pull up the PlayStation to see if we could gain some understanding into what's going on. And while it's tough to deduce any real information from
Round
this,
three.
I found the
Ready,
polygonal mesh to be
go!
rather interesting. If we go back to the Wipeout wireframe for instance, note how the basic structure is largely built out of pairs of triangles. The density is adjusted in the camera, of course, to reduce texture wobble, but it's a very common layout that you'll see in most PlayStation games. Looking again at the wireframe here in High Octane though, I feel like the clumping of triangles together feels rather unoptimized. Maybe it's a hint as to what's going on, who
Round
knows?
four.
But I found it
Ready,
interesting
go!
nonetheless. In addition, the two games use very different visuals with different textures and colors and everything. They barely look like the same game at times. What's really weird about High Octane though is that it seems like they've dialed in the game speed specifically for this low frame rate, at least on consoles. If you say run High Octane on an emulator like PlayStation or clock the virtual CPU, yeah, you can massively boost the frame rate, but then the game runs way too fast. Yeah, it's really not a good situation. But still, there's a lot more to High Octane than I have time to talk about in this video.
Who's
And thus,
next?
I recommend checking out Pandemonium's review of the Saturn version, where he interviews Peter Molyneux, getting to the bottom of this game's many issues. It's interesting stuff. Technically speaking, this one's a win for PlayStation just due to the better graphics, but honestly, everyone loses with High Octane. These three games then basically represent EA's initial outing on both consoles, at least in terms of racing games. Need for Speed would continue as a series with an amazing sequel in 1997, but alas, it never saw the light of day on Sega's machine. EA would continue to support the Saturn though, all the way up through
Round
early
one.
1998,
Ready,
but support
go!
started to grow thin by that point. The next EA racing game comes in the form of Android Racing in 1996. Developed by Stormfront Studios, previously known as Beyond Software. This studio was one of the first sports branding, way back in the 1990s. These developers
Round two.
Mario Andretti
Ready,
Racing for the Sega
go!
Genesis. And it basically to this 1996 32-bit racing game, Andretti Racing. Given EA Sports history on the Genesis, one would have high hopes for the Sega Saturn version, and thankfully the results are generally pretty good. This mix between simulation and arcade-style racing is fast, fun, and packed with content. It boasts a huge number of tracks as well, including my hometown, Cincinnati, Ohio. No, there's no Skyline Chili in the game, but hey, it's still a solid experience. Unfortunately, while the tech underneath isn't necessarily bad, there are a few technical hiccups that manifest on both Saturn and PlayStation. Firstly, this game features the most egregious texture warping I think I've ever seen. On PlayStation, textures near the camera display all sorts of strange angles, which is somewhat typical of the system, but on Saturn, things bend like crazy to the point where you might be wondering if your VDP has failed. Just look at these lines here along the side of the road, it's awful. Let me bring up the wireframe again. I'm wondering if the problem here is caused by using quads that are simply too large. Rather than subdividing the track into smaller segments, as you see in many other Saturn games, you have these huge squares right near the camera, and it seems like there's a mathematical precision issue causing them to bend. If we look at the PlayStation version, you can see that they subdivide the ground into much smaller chunks to minimize texture warping, not to say that it was completely successful, mind you. Still, in this regard, Saturn is a lot worse. In terms of performance then, the news is somewhat mixed. On one hand, both versions operate at roughly the same level of performance. On the other hand, that level of performance is 20 frames per second. Of course, people loved games like Wave Race 64, which is also 20 frames per second, so perhaps in the context of 1996 it's not such a big deal, but compared to the 30 FPS Wipeout, it does feel a lot slower. Still, the main takeaway here is that it's not a bad game despite the low frame rate, and both Sega and Sony fans were treated to roughly the same experience. So I'd say the developers did good work overall. Unfortunately, this release marks the second to last EA racing game to appear on Sega Saturn. You see, just over a year later, Stormfront Studios returned with another racing game for EA Sports, dubbed NASCAR 98. Yep, this is the year that EA got the rights to publish games based on NASCAR, and Stormfront took charge. This first iteration arrives on both Sega Saturn and PlayStation, but the results aren't quite as clear-cut as Andretti Racing. So the first issue I noted pertains to the game's video output on Saturn. Essentially, it runs entirely in interlaced mode for some reason, despite the visuals themselves rendering at a lower resolution. On a CRT, this makes the game look chunkier than you'd expect, but thankfully, the RetroTink 4K offers a workaround, meaning I was able to effectively convert the video signal and measure the game's performance data. Unfortunately, compared to Andretti, NASCAR 98 feels like a step down on the Sega Saturn. The draw distance is reduced compared to PlayStation, and the various distortion issues remain visible. It feels a lot scruffier on Sega's system, basically. And this is true of the performance as well. Just like Andretti, the game is capped at 20 frames per second, but this time the Saturn version dips into the teens on a regular basis, so it ends up feeling a lot worse to play overall versus the PlayStation version. Now granted, when simulating something like a NASCAR race, you need to handle a lot of cars on screen, and this is probably why the game had to be capped at 20 FPS, but dips into the teens really feels unacceptable to me. As a 1997 game, however, it was also starting to become clear that, in the West anyway, Sega Saturn's days were numbered. Now, the Saturn would continue to see success in Japan, of course, but Western companies started backing out, focusing primarily on Sony PlayStation or even Nintendo 64. And that's true of Electronic Arts. This was their second to last game ever released on the Saturn. Still, in terms of racing games overall, I feel that Electronic Arts did pretty okay on Sega Saturn. Certainly better than we saw with the Psygnosis ports anyway. The Need for Speed, Road Rash, and Andretti Racing are all excellent conversions that match or even exceed the PlayStation version. Only NASCAR 98 has a real advantage on Sony's machine, while High Octane is, well, quite frankly, rubbish on both platforms. But with EA covered, I wanted to shift gears and focus on something completely different. Japanese car culture has a rich history dating back decades. Along the way, its influence has been felt across different mediums: manga, film, and of course, video games. That feeling of tackling a mountain pass at speed or zipping through the veins of a highway network is one of the things that few could experience themselves, but games make it possible. One company that tapped into this early on is Genki. Formed in 1990 by an ex-Sega employee, Genki got its start working on a conversion of Hot B's Bad Omen for the Game Gear, known as Devilish. In 1994, the studio developed the first entry in the Shutoko Battle series for Super Famicom. This game challenges you to tune your car while mastering the art of the drift. It's built on Mode 7 technology, and it received a sequel just 1 year later, extending the concept even further. In 1996, Genki continued its Shutoko Battle series on the PlayStation with Drift King Shutoko Battle. Boasting the same title as the initial Super Famicom entry, this new PlayStation iteration took the series into full 3D, delivering high-speed drifting action around the Shuto Expressway. This received a US release as Tokyo Highway Battle and helped kickstart what would become a long-running franchise. Then in 1997, Shutoko Battle received a conversion for Sega Saturn. This was not Genki's first Saturn title, however, as they had released a trio of games within the first year of the system's life, including Wangan Dead Heat, also known as Highway 2000, which shares some commonalities with the Shuto Battle series. While the later Dreamcast games would focus on an innovative life bar mechanic, Shutoko Battle on Saturn and PlayStation is more of a straightforward affair that has you challenging rivals across various loops of the Shuto Expressway, all built out in 3D. You pick your car, tune it, and drive. It's visually rough around the edges, I might argue, but I was surprised at just how fun and playable it remains to this day. Drifting is challenging yet doable, and as you begin to learn the ropes, it becomes surprisingly engaging. Between races, you'll encounter the Drift King himself via these FMV sequences, while slowly working your way through the game. All of this is backed by an absolute banger of a soundtrack produced by T's Music, the same company responsible for the music in the Mega CD version of Final Fight. Take a listen. The best part of all this, though, is that the game itself is excellent on both Saturn and PlayStation. In what feels like a surprise twist, the performance is basically identical between the two games, and any and all differences come down to console-specific quirks. For instance, the texture warping and dithering are very noticeable on PlayStation, but the Saturn version lacks the distant fog effect, smoother day-to-night transitions, and transparent shadows. Curiously, the Saturn version seems to run at a slightly higher resolution, which also extends to the game's UI, drawing the speedometer as an oval rather than a circle as we see on PlayStation. While it pushes no technical boundaries, I feel like Genki did a fantastic job here and made what I'd describe as the best multi-platform racing game between the two consoles. It's an amazing racing title that's still fun, and I definitely recommend checking it out on either console. Thankfully, it's not the only well-executed multi-platform released on our remaining list. Street Racer from Ubisoft also deserves some credit. You see, this one started out life on Super NES in '94 and would receive many different ports to different platforms. This is interesting though, because basically every version of the game is different and built according to the specifications of the target hardware. The Super NES version relies on Mode 7, kind of like Mario Kart, while the Mega Drive and Amiga versions share more with games like Outrun or Hang On, where it draws that pseudo 3D track, but you can only really go forward or change lanes. Game Boy, of course, works similarly and has its own look. But then there's Saturn and PlayStation, and this is where things get a little strange. Essentially, while both versions share the exact same track layouts, the developers opted to build the visuals in a completely different way. Firstly though, it's important to note that Street Racer's tracks are all very short, and at first I found this odd, but thanks to the isometric mode, it all kinda clicked. You see, Street Racer is more like a pseudo 3D super off-road than a typical kart racer, and in that sense, the short tracks make a lot more sense. Got it? Okay, so let's see these games running side by side. This is the same track in terms of layout, a basic figure 8 design. Straight away, it's clear that the scenery and background art differs significantly between the two, something that holds true for most of the game's tracks. This same figure 8 track is also in the Super NES game, by the way, though obviously it's completely flat in that case. Now, both Saturn and PlayStation play the same, so the differences come down to how it's presented. PlayStation's track is made up from a traditional 3D polygon mesh. Objects such as racers and sprites, which require just 2 triangles for texture mapping without any lighting or anything, help produce the overall load. If we swap over to a wireframe view though, it's easier to understand what's going on. It looks like pretty much any other 3D PlayStation game, though the use of sprites here definitely speeds things up. It's impressive though to see this many triangles being tossed around at 60 frames per second this early in the generation. Now on Saturn we have something completely different. Compared to PlayStation, the ground layer is completely flat. There's no slopes or elevation changes here. So what's going on? Well, looking at the game in wireframe mode, this is what we get. All the visible objects on screen are generated by SVDP1. Those are sprites and other simple 3D objects. Everything else, however, is drawn by the second video display processor. That means the ground that you race on is a tile map. The sky is also interesting. It's a second moving layer featuring clouds that's drawn on top of everything and then blended with the ground layer to create moving clouds with shadows. So in a way, this is an example of what you get with, say, Mode 7-like graphics, but pushed to the next level with so many more objects and more detail per scene. I think it looks really great. And this is what I love about Street Racer. The developers leveraged the best of both Saturn and PlayStation without trying to shoehorn the same solutions onto both machines. As a result, you get super smooth 60 frames per second gameplay with minimal texture warping or artifacts. Thus, Street Racer alongside Shutoko Battle rests as one of the best examples of multi-platform racing on the two machines. Unfortunately, this isn't necessarily the case for our next game. This is Hardcore 4x4 from Gremlin Graphics, also lovingly known as Takayonku, Tough the Truck in Japan. In this game, you jump into the driver's seat of a pickup truck and bomb around in the mountains, and conceptually the idea is pretty fun. Plus there's a neat physics engine driving the action. There's just one problem. It runs like a wounded pig. Compared to Street Racer, this is basically the polar opposite. It is not an optimized multi-platform release at all. For starters, the PlayStation version is pretty choppy, averaging around 20 frames per second, but on Saturn, it's more around 10 to 15 frames per second. Yeah, it's that bad. In fact, it's so bad on Saturn that I would argue it runs even worse than High Octane, coming in as the choppiest racing game on the system. It is, in my opinion, unplayable garbage. PlayStation is slightly better, of course, but really 20 FPS still isn't all that good, and it dips below that during gameplay. Both versions exhibit plenty of noticeable input lag as well. In addition, the visuals are garbled and messy on both platforms with ugly track textures and noisy image quality. Peeking at the game in wireframe mode, you can see that it uses a fairly dense mesh here on the PlayStation, but on Saturn, even taking into account the transition from triangles to quads, it feels even more simplified. It's genuinely, shockingly just an ugly, choppy game, but it does win the Digital Foundry Award for the least optimized multi-platform racing game of the generation. Next up though is Formula Karts. This ain't your daddy's Mario Kart, this is real kart racing, or so they say. Honestly, this one kinda surprised me. The gameplay is fun. I enjoyed it a lot more than expected. The sensation of flinging your kart around the track feels surprisingly natural, yet challenging. It's certainly not in the upper echelon of racing games on these platforms, mind you, but it's not that bad. When comparing the two versions side by side, I was surprised to see that the developers did a pretty good job at matching the presentation. It looks very similar on both machines. Unfortunately, when it comes to performance, the Saturn version falls woefully short. Basically, since this is a PAL exclusive, it's stuck in 50Hz mode and thus 17 frames per second. Yeah, it's consistent, but 17 FPS for a racing game really does not feel good. The game is laggy and sluggish to play. It's better than Tough the Truck and High Octane, but it's still not a great showing. If you force your Saturn into NTSC mode though, the game does at least run at 20 frames per second instead, which is a minor improvement, but certain elements of the graphics are cut off. The PlayStation version in comparison, which is also a PAL-only release, sits at 25 frames per second consistently. Now keep in mind that since they're both running in 50Hz mode, 25 FPS from a PAL output is equivalent to 30 FPS in NTSC mode, while 17 FPS is more like 20 FPS in NTSC. This is just what Europe had to deal with back in the day. I know Richard still has nightmares about it. But it's a curious little game, at least, and one unique thing about the PlayStation version is that the developers don't use the system's dithering features, so when played on a real PS1, it's completely free of dithering artifacts, which is super rare on the system. On the Sega side though, it is interesting because one, the Sega version has high resolution menus, which is nice, and two, there's actually Sega branding in the game, which leads you to believe that the Saturn version would have been better than it actually is. Alas, if you're looking for some kart action, the PlayStation version is the way to go. Next up, Race Driving. This polygonal driving game is the sequel to one of the first 3D racing games ever made, Hard Driving from Atari. This is a difficult yet important game, but the real challenge lies in porting it to home platforms. During this era, developers were obsessed with bringing Hard Driving and its sequel Race Driving to home platforms that had no business running it. I gotta say though, the Amiga version is mighty impressive given its hardware, and I love that introductory sequence. But still, most versions were not good. However, years after its emergence, Time Warner saw fit to bring race driving back home on the Saturn and PlayStation, but only in Japan for some reason. These versions differ slightly in terms of overall content, but the goal is the same, to provide both the arcade original experience with its 3 tracks, alongside new, enhanced, textured tracks. Turns out, these are the first home consoles to do the concept justice, as the frame rate is finally stable and smooth, much higher than the arcade original. Plus, the polygon rendering looks better and the games just feel a lot more playable. Sure, you're missing the cockpit of the arcade original, but they play really well. Of course, this game looks very dated next to most of the other racing games on this list, but there is this sense of victory in finally being able to play a home conversion of race driving at an acceptable frame rate. When comparing the two though, it's clear that PlayStation comes out on top. Firstly, it features a wider FOV while driving and a much greater draw distance. Note how late this loop pops into view on the Saturn version. Furthermore, Saturn runs in a strange interlaced resolution, features worse menus, and a strangely scaled HUD. On top of that, all the newer content looks best on PlayStation. Now don't get me wrong, the Saturn version's still better than basically every prior home version, but the PlayStation version, which did come out a little later, definitely has the overall edge here. Still, it's an interesting release on both machines and arguably the only home versions worth bothering with. So how about a few games that fall just outside the typical racing game genre, yet still involve some sort of driving and or racing? First up, one of my favorite arcade games, Night Striker from Taito. Built within an immersive cabinet with a CRT placed deep within a light-up chassis, Night Striker is Taito's take on the space area formula. Set within a fictional dystopian cityscape, you take control of a flying vehicle as you blast across ruined landscapes while Zuntata music flows through your speakers. It's sublime. Night Striker saw its first official home port on the Mega CD in Japan, and while it's somewhat chunky visually, it did a decent job recreating the feeling of playing Night Striker, and includes an amazing remastered soundtrack as well. Some years later then, Night Striker made its debut on both PlayStation and Sega Saturn. The Saturn version came out a little later, sporting the title Night Striker S. So what the heck is the difference? Well, when it comes to the tech side, not much. Despite the age of the arcade game, these two 32-bit conversions failed to match the 60 frames per second performance of the arcade game. Instead, they run at 30 frames per second. Now, I wouldn't say this is a deal breaker, as it still plays pretty well, and ports of this type seen on older generation machines would have been a lot choppier still, but I would have loved proper 60 FPS versions of Night Striker. Thankfully, in terms of the visuals themselves, both conversions perfectly capture that arcade original. So what does the S stand for in Night Striker S? Well, that basically refers to some minor enhancements. Firstly, there's a CGI intro movie, if you're into that thing, and an extra game mode with its own ultra-challenging stages, making it ultimately the better version of the two games. That said, in terms of pure gameplay and performance and visual quality, they're basically equal. But that's not all, there's still more games to talk about. Firstly, there's Mass Destruction. Now, this one doesn't really fit the typical genre norms per se, but I feel it's worth mentioning as it's a very interesting game technically. You see, you're tasked with driving a tank around a battlefield from an overhead perspective while blowing up basically everything along the way, similar to something like Return Fire or maybe even Blast Corps, but what makes it stand out is its performance on Saturn. You see, this is a game that manages a perfect 60 frames per second on Sega's machine. That's right, it's smooth as butter on the Saturn and looks remarkably sharp and clean in motion. In comparison, the game on PlayStation is capped at 30 frames per second. Even better, Saturn uses VDP2 to render the game's floor, while PlayStation requires the use of polygons, which is both more demanding and worse looking due to polygon wobble. So it's a great example of a developer leveraging the Saturn's unique characteristics to solve a rendering problem. As a result, the Saturn easily takes the win in this case. Next up, Imagixel's violent post-apocalyptic taxi game Quarantine also came to both Saturn and PlayStation in 1996. Unlike the original PC and 3DO releases, these conversions were published exclusively in Japan under the names Death Throttle and Hard Rock Cab respectively. The goal is the same. Drive around an open world city while picking up and dropping off customers, taking on different missions, and delivering packages. This predates games like Crazy Taxi or even Grand Theft Auto, but the concept is kinda similar in a way. The difference here is the insane violence. You'll need to shoot and maim just about everything in your way. Speaking of Grand Theft Auto, the Canadian developer behind this game was ultimately acquired by Take-Two Interactive, where they would become known as Rockstar Toronto. I guess those violent driving action routes in Quarantine really paid off in the long run. The concept and world they built in this game is certainly interesting, especially for 1994. Now, all of this is beautifully depicted in the game's wonderfully cheesy FMV introduction movie.
Buildings continue to burn out of control throughout the Lower East Side this morning. So if you're living downtown, wake up, because you're on fire.
I love this piece that they made for the game. It's a really great example of what you can do with FMV to set the mood, so to speak. Once you jump behind the wheel though, much like 3DO and even the PC version to some extent, you'll discover a problem. The performance is not good. The game's frame rate is very low, and the game feels unresponsive to play, especially on PlayStation. Yes, this is a case where the Sega Saturn version manages to come out on top. While it's still far from smooth on Sega's machine, the average frame rate is noticeably higher than PlayStation, and the game's graphics are improved. Specifically, 2D sprites and such throughout the world are far more pixelated on PlayStation 1. That version also features green blood because, you know, it was the 90s. I actually pulled up the wireframe for this one on PlayStation as well, mainly because in its original form this wasn't really a polygonal game. So it's interesting to see how it all kind of comes together. However they're drawing it, the triangular mesh is extremely dense in this version of the game. It reminds me of Road Rash, which makes me think they're doing something a little different with the rendering. Perhaps this is actually a software-drawn game. Just a shame it runs this poorly though. So while I love the theme of this game, I was pretty disappointed by the poor performance. If you had to choose between the two though, I'd have to give Saturn the nod, especially with a name like Death Throttle. Come on now. Next up is another change of pace. A racing game, but not with vehicles. This is Zap Snowboarding Tricks 98 from Atelier Double, a small Japanese company that produced a wide range of software and ports until its demise. Tricks 98 is a sequel to what was originally a Saturn exclusive, but this time it makes noticeable improvements to the core gameplay. You'll take part in various events including races, slalom, freestyle, and more, and once you get the hang of it, it's a lot of fun. The thing is though, despite its origins on Saturn, the PlayStation version winds up offering a much more refined experience. So what do I mean? Well, for starters, you have performance. This is another case where PlayStation runs a game at 30 frames per second while Saturn is limited to just 20. That alone already makes a sizable difference in terms of playability, as we know from Wipeout. But in a surprising twist, the Saturn version suffers from another problem: texture distortion. This level of distortion is honestly just about the worst I can ever recall seeing on the Saturn, to the point where I'm really not sure what the heck's going on here. The textures near the player basically become garbled, leading to a swimmy looking game that never feels quite right. So let's look at the wireframe, shall we? I suspect the problem is simply down to the size of the quads they're using. They're too large. You need a mesh of a higher density to overcome this limitation, and they're simply not doing it. Based on some of the views we're seeing, it also feels like their occlusion calling isn't as aggressive as you might expect for a game from this era. It's drawing a lot of scenery that you probably won't be able to see from your current position, which perhaps puts additional strain on the system, resulting in a 20 FPS frame rate. The PlayStation version has the typical texture warping you expect of that platform, but the issue on Saturn is so much worse and very different. Plus, the game is less colorful and has a darker, uglier overall appearance. I don't know what went wrong here on the tech side, but this is definitely one of the games that's best experienced on the PlayStation. I also noticed a few other interesting differences, such as the third track during the championship race. On Saturn, it's depicted at dusk, while the PlayStation version takes place during the day. Now, if you have an interest in playing Zap Snowboarding Tricks 98, the game was released worldwide. The North American version was published by Capcom and it's known as Freestyle Borden 99. The European version, though, published by Funsoft, is known as Fat Air Extreme Snowboarding, which is arguably one of the greatest game titles of all time. This is, of course, only the PlayStation version. The Saturn version is exclusive to Japan, but I don't recommend that version. The final vehicle-based game I want
Take that!
Wanted to touch on though is Off-World Interceptor Extreme from Crystal Dynamics. Starting life on the 3DO, Crystal brought this to both Saturn and PlayStation shortly after launch. The idea: drive a sprite-based truck forward across alien landscapes while blasting targets and surviving. It's comically over the top to the point where in the US version, cutscenes rely on an MST3K style audience overlay, though it's nowhere near as funny. The Japanese version does not include this.
Who's here? Trash man.
We prefer sanitary engineers.
Bloodthirsty macho mercenaries.
Or that.
Ooh.
You've obviously read our
What
resumes.
are you boys gonna learn? You don't win battles with biceps. And
What
you
about
can't
fancy
spend a
footwork?
bounty.
When comparing the two, though, I would say that Crystal did an excellent job here. They both look comparable in terms of visual features, with the only drawback being the lack of transparency on Sega Saturn, as we'd come to expect. Instead, you get this dithered smoke and fire in place of the beautiful transparencies on PlayStation. Performance-wise, both versions target 20 frames per second, but the Saturn version falls short once again with an overall lower average frame rate. It's plagued by slowdown. They're both smoother than the 3DO original, mind you, but PlayStation clearly has the edge here. Couple this with better video quality and proper transparencies, and frankly, you have a pretty easy choice. But that marks the end of racing and driving games between Saturn and PlayStation. Thus, it's time to tally everything up and figure out where the two consoles stand. In this corner, we have the PlayStation with superior versions of Wipeout, Wipeout 2097, Destruction Derby, NASCAR 98, Zap Snowboarding Tricks 98, Race Driving, Off-World Interceptor, and Formula Karts, along with, technically, Tough the Truck and High Octane, which are better on PlayStation, but hardly a win for anyone. In the other corner, we have the Sega Saturn with superior versions of Mass Destruction, Road Rash, The Road and Track presents The Need for Speed, and Death Throttle. And sitting right in the middle of the ring, tied and equally great on both platforms, despite their differences, we have Street Racer, Night Striker, Shutoko Battle, and Andretti Racing. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of round one. So, what are my final thoughts? Well, racing games were a hot commodity back during this era, and PlayStation's multi-platform presence is certainly superior to what Sega had on offer. But a lot of this comes down to the success of Wipeout and Destruction Derby. The other games on the PlayStation side are arguably less important, and really the system's success in the racing sphere was ultimately determined by exclusives. And the same is true of Saturn. Road Rash and Need for Speed are certainly not small titles, so that's a big win for Sega's system, right? But overall, Saturn falls short of PlayStation in this category. Yet, like PlayStation, Saturn's best racing games were also console exclusives. So between the two, you have a very strong library of racing and driving games to enjoy. Looking across the entirety of the library though, my number one picks for racing/driving on Saturn and PlayStation are as follows. On Saturn, my number one is Sega Rally Championship, while on PlayStation, it's all about that Ridge Racer Type 4. This is just the beginning, however, and there are many, many additional genres to explore between these two machines, so on our next installment, look for a head-to-head comparison between the many types of shooters that graced both machines. You've got run and guns, horizontal shooters, vertical shooters, and more. Perhaps this is where Saturn will finally get its revenge? Tune in next time to find out. And thank you for watching DF Retro.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Sega Sundays. My name is Justin Towell and today we are going to be playing Daytona USA on the Sega Saturn. This is obviously running on real hardware because nothing else would look like this. It's
この時を待ってたぜ。
Are you ready for this?
Round one. Ready, go! Knockout! Round two. Ready, go!
Yeah. Yep.
Knockout! Round three. Ready, go! Knockout!
Ta! 再戦したくば来い。 The big time player is here.
Round one. Ready, go!
Checkmate.
Knockout! Round two. Ready, go!
Yeah.
Knockout! Round three. Ready, go! Knockout! Round four. Ready, go!
Yeah.
Knockout!
Cha! Don't worry, pal. I won't forget you.
Round one. Ready, go! Knockout! Round two. Ready, go! Knockout! Round three. Ready, go! Excellent! Round four. Ready, go! Knockout! Round five. Ready, go! Knockout!
Here comes my suplex.
Round one. Ready, go! Knockout! Round two. Ready, go! Knockout! Round three. Ready, go! Knockout! Round four. Ready, go! Knockout. Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout.
I assume you're ready.
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout. Round 2. Ready, go! Ring out. Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout.
I assume you're ready.
Round 1. Ready, go!
Yeah! Take that! Yeah! Take that!
Knockout. Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout. Round 3. Ready, go!
Yeah! Take that! Yeah! Yeah!
Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout!
残念だったな、凡人くん。
新技の実験台にしてやるぜ。私の強さを見せてやろう。
Round 1. Ready, go!
くらえ。
Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go! Excellent!
.そのまま床を舐めてな。この時を待ってたぜ。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout!
.まだ現役じゃわい。 よし行くぞ。
修行の成果はあ見せるわよ。
Round 1. Ready, go!
甘いわね。やったい。
Ring out!
やったい。
Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Ring out! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
Ora, ora, ora! この時を待ってたぜ。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Ring out! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout!
be celebrating tonight! I won't go easy on you.
Round one. Ready, go! Excellent! Round two. Ready, go! Knockout!
Finish!
Round three. Ready, go! Knockout! Round four. Ready, go!
Take that! Yeah! Yeah! Yep.
Knockout!
Now that's Mariner's power!
Let's see how many seconds you'll last. Are you ready for this?
Round one. Ready, go! Knockout! Round two. Ready, go! Knockout! Round three. Ready, go! Knockout! Round four. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
久しぶりの土俵だ。ガチンコで行くぜ。よし、行くぞ。
Round 1. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
Mada mada!
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
いつでも相手になってやるさ。 お前を絶望で満たしてやる。4000年の重み。知るがよい。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Excellent!
「残念だったな、凡人くん。」
I won't lose!
すぐ楽にしてやるぜ。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go!
My time is here!
よし。
Knockout!
Yes! What a knucklehead!
I'll take you down and take your name.
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Ring out! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout!
Try training next time.
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout!
This'll hurt you more than it hurts me!
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
Now that's Mariner's power! 行くぞ
Let's see how many seconds you'll last. Are you ready for this?
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout!
Time for a combat seminar.
最強の格闘技を教えてやろう。空手だよ。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go!
久しぶりの土俵だ。ガチンコで行くぜ。
覚悟はできてますの？
Round 1. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 2. Ready, go! Excellent! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 5. Ready, go! Knockout!
This.
I won't go easy on you.
よろしゅうお頼申します。
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 3. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 4. Ready, go!
からだけでは明かしまへん。
This'll hurt you more than it hurts me!
この時を待ってたぜ
Round 1. Ready, go! Knockout! Round 2. Ready, go! Knockout!